news stories today that fit together like a hand in a glove. Here's the first one. Stephen Guilbeault, the convicted criminal that Trudeau appointed to be Canada's environment minister, he announced to a foreign audience, of course, that he wants to phase out fossil fuels by 2050 or earlier, he says. That might sound very far into the future, but it's actually not. We're halfway through 2023. It's almost 2024. So imagine phasing out every natural gas stove, every furnace, every barbecue, every car and truck, except for Tesla, I guess, every ship, every airplane, every tractor, every combine, most power plants. Just here in Canada, though, mind you, the rest of the world is going full tilt with fossil fuels. Here's CNN. Their story says, China approved equivalent of 2 new coal plants a week in 2022, report finds. China is surging ahead with coal, a new report shows, rapidly approving and building new power plants despite its own promises to cut back on carbon as the world plunges ever deeper into the climate crisis. Last year, are you feeling the crisis? Are you nervous? They want you to be nervous. The pandemic's gone, so this is how they're going to make you afraid. Last year, the country approved the highest number of new coal-fired power plants since 2015. According to the report released Monday by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and the Global Energy Monitor. You don't say. So China isn't following the rules that we're supposed to follow. Here's how the left-wing NPR, National Public Radio, put it. Their headline was, China is building 6 times more new coal plants than other countries, report finds. Than other countries combined. Let me read you the line so you know that's not an error. They're quoting a research analyst. Everybody else is moving away from coal, and China seems to be stepping on the gas, she says. We saw that China has 6 times as much plants starting construction as the rest of the world combined. But she's not quite right when she says everyone is moving off coal. That's just not true. Brazil isn't. Indonesia isn't. India isn't. India really tied for China as the largest, most populous country. Look at this story. India power giant to add more coal plants to meet soaring demand. Oh, okay. Anyways, back to our guy. We're so proud of him, Stephen Guilbeault. He was jetting around the world, as climate activists tend to do. He was in Brussels, Belgium, which is lovely. And here's what he told them. He said, according to this report, Canadian minister, fossil fuels must be phased out no later than 2050. World nations must agree to phase out unabated fossil fuels no later than 2050 and earlier if possible, says Stephen Guilbeault, with any residual oil and gas emissions mitigated thanks to carbon capture and storage technology, he told Euractiv in an interview. They asked a follow-up question. They said, the EU, the European Union, is pushing for a phase-out of unabated fossil fuels well ahead of 2050. Does Canada support a date for this? And he says, in its April communique, the G7 agreed that we needed to eliminate unabated fossil fuels at the latest by 2050. And I think we will collectively strive to do this more rapidly. The discussion has started, and it will undoubtedly continue until COP28. COP28 is the name of the annual conference of the parties. This is their 28th annual meeting to deal with global warming. They love it. I mean, if there was no fight to fight, they couldn't get together and jet around every year. They love the crisis. It's like the poverty industry. They don't want to get rid of poverty. It's how they get rich. It's really an annual reunion of politicians and bureaucrats and lobbyists. I'll get back to the lobbyist part in a minute. So back to the oil and gas phase-out. Get a load of this. Question. The phase-out date will be one of the key topics for discussion at the COP28 summit later this year. What is Canada's stance on this? And Guilbeault said, currently, our position is that it should be done no later than 2050. We're certainly open to a conversation to see whether we can agree on an earlier date and what it means. It's important to set ourselves some objectives and targets, but it's equally important that we understand our capacity to reach those objectives, even if that is 20 or 25 years in the future. So the oil sands are going to be phased out, in case you don't understand what he's saying. No later than 20 or 25 years from now. You heard him. One more thing, Canada emits 670 megatons of carbon dioxide a year, according to the government, if you believe them. And of course, Canada is now bringing in 1 million new migrants every year. So that's about 2.5%, 3% growth in our population per year. And all those people breathe out CO2. Some liberals say they want to have 100 million people in Canada, by the way. It's nuts. But of course, everyone who comes needs to cook with a stove, needs to have heat in their home in the winter, needs to move around in a car. If you're adding 3% of the population every year, you're naturally going to have 3% growth in carbon dioxide emissions just based on population. If you're worried about that sort of thing, I'm not actually. I'm not worried about CO2, but look at this. This is Gilboa again. In Canada's case, we need to reduce our annual emissions by about 300 megatons per year by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. So hang on. So we need to cut our emissions almost in half. We're at 670. He says we got to cut 300 out of that. Cars, heating your home, transportation, factories, schools, farmers, whatever. Cut it in half, even though the population is growing by 3% a year because of immigration. That's insane. That's impossible, of course. But that's their plan, and they are going to try to do it. That's what they mean by net zero. It's madness, but don't think for a moment that the elite ruling class won't still drive in limousines and fly on private jets to COP28. That's how it is for the ruling club. You're not in that club. But here's another story that's related. In the news today, this is from Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster, Alberta filed first ever criminal charges against a carbon offset firm. Here's why they may not be the last. 25 charges filed against company involved in auditing carbon offsets highlight regulatory challenges. For the first time ever, a Canadian province has filed criminal charges against a business for providing false information related to carbon offsets, a spokesperson for Alberta's Environment Ministry said, underscoring the sometimes murky activities of companies in a complicated, rapidly growing industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Carbon offsets are bought and sold under a trading system with governments putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions to compel companies to fight climate change. Since 2007, Alberta has run a mandatory carbon offset system for large emitters such as oil and gas companies, landfills, and food processing firms. If they produce more than their allotted levels of carbon dioxide, they must purchase credits to offset these emissions. The credits are generated by companies that reduce emissions by doing things like building wind farms or installing solar panels. To ensure accuracy is my favorite part. The credits are verified by third-party auditors. The Alberta litigation centers on the role of one of these third-party verifiers. But that's the thing. How do you know? How do you audit a carbon offset? How do you audit carbon at all? It's a natural element in the periodic table. It's in the air. It's what a great many things are made of. Have you ever heard the word hydrocarbon or carbs, carbohydrates, carburetors? You see the word in there, carbon. It's one of the most common elements in the world. It's in most of our food. It's in most parts of us as people. It's in the breath we exhale. It's what plants inhale. How do you even track it? Well, you can't. You can guess, you can make estimates, which is why it's such a beautiful scam.